Unitarian Church. Most of our church records are there, but other churches then, because of this project, donated their records as well. And on the right is me with all those boxes. Those are that is the UU Congregational Archive. One of my students. Okay, so that is the collection that we have put together. If any of you are part of an organization that is interested in doing such a thing with your own records, I'm happy to talk to you about that. Okay. We also produced an exhibit, and we had, there's about 70 photos in the book, and we then also took a bunch of those photos and made photo panels. And we had them on display at our church, and then a couple of other churches have also now, since then, had them on display in their church. And if any of you want part of that, or the panels were made by this company on the south side called Modern Reproductions, and they were terrific. So I really recommend them. Okay. So let me give a little background here first. What I'm trying to do here is make sure that my papers don't blow away. I don't want my papers to blow away as I'm talking. Okay. So a little background. Unitarian. I'm going to primarily focus on the Unitarian side of this. Okay. There's really two threads: Unitarian and Universalist. I would say that in Pittsburgh, the more dominant thread has been the Unitarian. Okay, so I'm going to talk mostly about that. We can, if you want questions afterwards, maybe you can ask me a little bit about the Universalist side. So Unitarianism came from many threads. It was never one thing, okay? And it really started with people holding Unitarian views as soon as Trinitarian doctrines were put forward. But it really takes on much more force with the Protestant Reformation. We all know about Martin Luther, and we know about John Calvin, who really were strong figures in the Protestant Reformation. But there were other thinkers as well in that time who voiced other views that were more along the lines of Unitarian thought. For the English Unitarian people were mostly influenced by this guy here, Faustus Socinus, who was a Polish thinker, part of what is called the Polish Brethren. Their idea was that Jesus was simply not divine. He influenced Joseph Priestley, who ends up being a very important English Unitarian. Seen as more radical than, say, the American Unitarians, who really come out of New England, okay? They followed the ideas of Jacobus Arminius, who was a Dutch Unitarian thinker. His idea was simply to have a more liberal Christian view, to say that God was more benevolent than the Calvinist God was depicted, to say that man has a potential for good instead of insisting that man was depraved. And according to Jacob Arminius, Jesus occupied a halfway status, okay? He was part human and part divine. Well, the English and the Americans didn't really want much to do with each other. They kind of kept distance from each other through all this. So the first Unitarian in Pittsburgh was Benjamin Bakewell. Bakewell you may know as a glass industrialist. He came to Pittsburgh in 1808, and it turns out that he was of the English school. He was influenced to become a Unitarian by reading Joseph Priestley in England. He had several business reversals. As it turns out, he came to America, came to New York City in 1794, which was the same year that Joseph Priestley came. The family record says that he came because of his businesses failed. I think there might be more to that story, because at that time Unitarians were being persecuted in England because many of them supported the French in the French Revolution, and that was politically difficult because England was at war with France at the time. So he came to Pittsburgh. All right. This is a very cool map. Comes from a book of trails and roads going through the Allegheny Mountains. And you can see from this map, I don't know the exact route that he took, but probably from New York down to Philadelphia, and then across here to was the Lancaster Road, down here, Harrisburg, and then across here, and then up to Pittsburgh. That's what I'm thinking. He could have also gone this way. I don't know. But he came via a Jersey wagon and pair. A Jersey wagon was like a very large covered wagon. It was intended for freight, okay? And with 9 people, himself, his wife, their 4 children, Mrs. Starkey, who was their housekeeper, Nellie the girl, don't know anything about her, and then they had 1 slave boy, which was very typical of people of their status and at that time. This is the business that he built up, the Bakewell glass. You've seen that probably at the museum and such. This is an image of some of the products that they made. He was very famous for making flint glass and high quality flint glass. The reason I show this is this particular image is of a communion chalice that he made that was used at the First Unitarian Church in Pittsburgh, and it was also used at the Unitarian Church in Meadville, Pennsylvania. The Meadville, you know, little Meadville, okay, north of here, right, established the second Unitarian Church west of the Allegheny Mountains, largely because of the founder being influenced by the Pittsburgh Church. Okay, so here's just a little map that shows you, we pretty much think that Bakewell glass was right about here. It was on Water Street, and we think it was right there. Now, Bakewell didn't have very many followers or compatriots in Pittsburgh. It was, as you know, mostly Scotch-Irish Presbyterians here and some Episcopalians at that day. But what happens is he finally collects a few people who, you know, seem to agree with him. And in 1820, they hired an English Unitarian minister to come to Pittsburgh. So Reverend John Campbell came to Pittsburgh. He had once been Calvinistical in his training. That's what he writes about this, okay? But study led him to hold Unitarian views, but he was very afraid of it at first, and he writes that he trembled for the consequences of how this would change his views. Now, he had developed asthma from ministering to miners in the coal fields of Newcastle upon Tyne in England. And his doctor recommended that he come to Pittsburgh for his health. Isn't that interesting? Well, you know, they probably had kind of imagined views of what it was like, the American West, right? But of course, Pittsburgh already had all these factories situated as it was right on the rivers. Well, they built a church in 1823, and this was it. It was built. You have a question?
So the wife wanted a family dog?
Yeah, there was that too. Together, the wife. Okay, the daughter was living in Pittsburgh. Okay, their older daughter was living in Pittsburgh. She wrote to her father and asked him to please come, and he held off. His wife, who was with him, and their other 3 daughters said, "Oh, let's go, because then all the family will be together, and if anything happens to you, see, then we'll all be together." But it is his doctor who ultimately said, you know, it will improve your asthma if you get out of here and go to Pittsburgh. Okay? Yeah, right. Right. TOG is together. Yeah, he understands. So anyway, next. Okay, so this is the church that they built. It didn't look anything like the Presbyterian and you know, other much larger churches, Episcopal churches in the area. It looks like kind of a meeting house, and it almost has a frontier quality to it, but also I think quite elegant. It was situated on the corner of Smithfield and Virgin Alley, which today is Oliver Avenue. So think of the corner of Smithfield and Oliver Avenue. Yeah, right. There, let's see. Oh, this image just honestly, I thought my heart would break when I found it. because I just really gave up any hope of finding an image of this church. But the John Canning that Helen referred to, who's going to be coming here with David Grinnell. Okay, John Canning is a friend of mine. I used to teach with his wife. He was at the Heinz Center when I was there one day. He says, "Oh, Kathy, you should look at the new book that came out about the first Lutheran church. It's called The Last on Grant." I don't know if any of you have seen it, but the Lutherans met in this church before they constructed their own church, and so this picture is in the book on the Lutheran history, and so that is how we found it. I was just thrilled to find it. So David Grinnell scanned it for us, and we got permission for that, and it's in our book, so it's actually on the back cover. Okay, so all right. Oops, I think I wrote this back. Okay, here's a map that shows you. I think this is the corner where the church was. I think it was on this northeast corner based on the descriptions. I think that Bakewell's house was either one of these two. This is a map from Joseph Rischel's book, Founding Families of Pittsburgh, and he gave me permission to use the maps in his book. They were constructed by some people at Pitt. Okay, so I think that these are all founding, the residences of founding families. It's a very interesting book if you ever want to pick it up somewhere. Just a small volume. But okay, so I think that's where Bakewell probably lived. So all of these things, of course, are within walking distance. Now, Campbell's asthma unfortunately got worse. Yeah, it was very sad. And he got there in 1820. They built the church in 1823, and he died then in 1824. His daughter wrote a memory, like a remembrance of him, and she says that she offered him some water, and he says, "I want no more of this world. Behold death. Oh, the pleasing hope and glorious immortality." That was kind of 19th century. They were very flowery with their language. Now, Bakewell was very optimistic at first, thinking that things were, he would be able to get ministers now from New England, but that didn't happen because, as it turns out, yes, some ministers came, but they never stayed very long. They didn't like Pittsburgh. It was very hard to get someone from New England to come and live here. It was geographically and culturally just too far removed, from what they had known in New England. Pittsburgh was still seen as pretty rough and tumble, pretty coarse, and smoky and all that. So finally, in the mid-1830s, the AUA, that stands for the American Unitarian Association, worked with the Society for Propagating the Gospel to Indians and Others in North America, which was founded in 1787 in Boston. And now they started providing funds to help these fledgling churches in the West. Bakewell was somewhat apologetic when they offered to give him money to hire some ministers, and he said, well, the people in the West overlook a little want of connection in a discourse if delivered with that greater, wait a minute, that's not quite all of it, let me see. Oh, I wrote it down. Okay, he offered that a popular manner was more important than erudition. Most of these ministers in New England are educated at Harvard, right? That was the place for Unitarian ministers to get their degree. He offered that a popular manner was more important than erudition. The people in the West, are much attracted to extemporaneous preaching and overlook a little want of connection and discourse if delivered with that greater degree of energy that mode seems to indicate. So basically, it was kind of a little bit of a put down of people in the West, but basically saying, maybe part of the reason some of these ministers don't stay is because they're kind of too educated for people in the West. Henry Miles was one of those ministers. He came in 1836, and he explains the route he took. This is a letter he wrote in 1892. He's reminiscing about what happened, and he says he went by train from Philadelphia. Of course, this is now 30 years after Bakewell came here, right? Okay, so he says he went by train from Philadelphia to Harrisburg, by canal from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, right? When he stepped out onto the wharf, he walked as quickly as he could to the place where he had been directed. This was a Sunday morning. He found 50 or 60 people waiting for him to preach. The letter explains that he was sent by a missionary society, and he says, who should have sent an older man, but it was impossible to get anybody to go. You know, they just didn't want to be here. In this same letter, written in 1892, he closes, I wish you success in your hard field of labor. Okay, so he saw Pittsburgh as a real hard field of labor, a hard place to go. Bakewell dies in 1844. He wills the church to his heirs, who then sell it to, I think it was a Calvinist society. I think I ran into that somewhere. And, but he has by this time endeared himself to many people in Pittsburgh. He was president of the school board for a long time, and when he died, all the school children were lined up on the curb to watch his funeral procession go by on foot, which is what he wanted. So the next minister was Mordecai Delane. He comes in 1850. He's an interesting person in that he's not from New England. He's actually from St. Louis. And he had been Jewish, and he left Judaism, and then decided, after meeting some important ministers out there, that he would become a Unitarian. And he comes to Meadville, has a year of training at the Meadville Theological School, and then he goes around the Ohio Valley, starting up churches along the Ohio River and in Mississippi, and then he comes to Pittsburgh. And he writes, he knows about the failure of what happened under Bakewell, and he says, Pittsburgh is a post of surprising importance in which we have to retrieve the disgrace and dispiriting results of failure. By Christmas Day, 1850, and he had been actually offered then another church in Detroit, which was very well to do, but the Pittsburgh people were very poor. He writes about that. But then he says, the prospects in Pittsburgh are better for being so bad. Morality is low, drunkenness, street fights, and other evils abound. The municipal government is in a wretched condition. Yeah. You know, I always like that. And yet, churches are numerous and well attended. Dare we then abandon the place? And so he stays for 11 years, even though he wasn't, planning to stay quite that long. And he'll go off after that. During the war, he becomes a chaplain in the Missouri Penitentiary. And then after the war, he comes back to Pittsburgh and he runs a tanning business. But then while he's, for hides and such, and then while he's doing that, he still preaches for the Unitarians, basically, just on a donated basis. Okay, let's see. Are there any questions as I'm going through? Okay. All right, now, unfortunately, the Civil War caused a lot of upheaval. Bless you. Yes. Caused a lot of upheaval in Pittsburgh. Some people got very rich off of it, and a lot of people lost everything. And of course, many people died, right? And so what ends up happening is about 1872 or so, we think that the society folded again, and the Unitarians kind of disappeared from view. Until 1889, and then a minister from Jamestown, New York came here for a couple years. His name was James Graham Townsend, but he left after 2 years because his previous society wanted him back, and so he went back there. So then came Charles Eliot St. John, and he ends up being a very powerful, very influential force. He was here from 1891 to 1900, so 9 years. Very earnest, very energetic. What's interesting about him that I think makes him different, I mean, I kind of sort of developed this thesis out of this, and that is that ministers who were willing to stay in Pittsburgh were ministers who had lived some part of their life in the West or had some experience in the West. People from New England just didn't want to be here in general, you know. So, and he was born in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, and grew, you know, spent some of his childhood there. His father was a Universalist minister, and he had moved around in the Midwest a bit with that, and finally ended up in New England. And ended up becoming a Unitarian minister. What I think is interesting about St. John, and I don't want to say a whole, you know, spend a whole lot of time on the theology here. I'm not sure how much you're interested in that. But, you know, Unitarian thinking has, is a religion that has evolved over time because it has always been open to science and changes in technology, changes in social thought and such. And I would say that his thinking reflects some of the changes that had taken place in the 19th century. He still sees revelation in the Bible, divine revelation in the Bible, which most Unitarians did at that time. In fact, he attended a society of the secularists in Pittsburgh, mostly to tell them what idiots they were. This is what his wife says, okay. Then he returns to speak to them the next time on, quote, the necessity of a belief in God. Okay, so that's where he's at. Later, he also quotes Ralph Waldo Emerson, talking about a woodland walk salves my worst wounds, and seeing divine revelation in nature, okay? So by this time, he's drawing, he's trying to draw revelation from both of these sources. He is also, by this time, very accepting of evolution. Unitarians tended to accept evolution before other groups did. He invited a minister to come speak, Minot Savage, who was very known for being very outspoken on evolution. He campaigned for money to build a church, and again he was appealing to, quote, millionaires to get money for the church. He wrote dozens of letters. I quoted some of his phrases. If you strike any millionaire who is dying to give away a few $1,000s and won't give it to the AUA, please tell him we are building a church in Pittsburgh, i.e. wanting to build a church. Millionaires are giving money for libraries. Who's he talking about there? Carnegie, right? They should be giving some for Unitarian churches. And here he's talking about the need for more Unitarian churches in the country. He says, what we await to put us to work is one ardent Unitarian millionaire. Still waiting, right? This is the church they end up building. It looks more like a meeting house instead of, you know, a more typical church. It was on the corner where St. Paul's Cathedral is today. Okay, if you can imagine that corner. On the corner of Craig and 5th Street. St. John said about this church that it would, the possibilities of this church were very good for Pittsburgh. He believed that a Unitarian church here would lay its loving hand on the city of Pittsburgh. And the Pittsburgh Press wrote about it, Pittsburgh Times wrote about it. It ranks as an event in the religious history of Pittsburgh comparable to the World Parliament of Religions, coming to Chicago that same year. It is the hour of chanting, come to one of the chief strongholds of orthodoxy, and it is here to stay. So it was very kind of celebratory. The Pittsburgh Times was very favorable to St. John. His sermons were in the paper all the time, and they would show up on Sunday night to pick up his sermon so that they could write a review of it or post part of it in the paper the next day. St. John would fit in with what was called social gospel ministry at the time. He was influenced by social gospel thinking, which was very much influenced by labor unrest and all these immigrants pouring into the cities and being very poor and such. So you find ministers in many denominations. The idea of social gospel ministry was, you know, ministers taking religion to the streets, okay, and taking religion to the elements of society that really need to be lifted up. But one of the things that he runs into here is that he is very interested in the labor unrest. Of course, as soon as he gets here, he arrives in October 1891, and the following July, what happens? Who knows? The Homestead Strike, right. July 1892, and Henry Clay Frick, we know, was instrumental in breaking the strike, right? And this leads to the end of the steel union, basically, in the United States, and for a long, long time. Well, understand, these ministers, and St. John was one of them, all write about this, okay? And the newspaper covered this, and so if you go into the Pittsburgh papers, there's all these reports of what the ministers were saying about the Homestead Strike. And what I discovered is that the closer the church was to Homestead, the more sympathetic the minister was to the strikers, to the workers, all right? That doesn't, that makes sense, okay? That, it doesn't surprise me. St. John tried to walk a middle line. He basically says here, owners should not reduce wages, but labor unions can be a menace to all. The trouble with unions is they will never believe that an employer speaks the truth. Well, he was blasted a week later by a press reader who basically chastised him by name and said, he should know monopoly is today the curse of America. Yeah. So, let's see. Okay. Meanwhile, the Women's Alliance, okay, their approach to all this was to take the trolley down to the south side and to look at the Southside Hospital there in the neighborhood of the great mills where there are many accidents. This is a quote from a letter that Martha St. John, who was the wife of the minister, what she wrote to her mother, okay? And so they came back, and the Women's Alliance began sewing, as she says, with a will. And they sewed every month all kinds of hospital garments, bedclothes and whatnot for these people in the hospitals. And she writes to her mother, there is a large foreign population here, workers in the great industries, and there are many poor quarters. It is certainly an interesting city. So I think her insights. She also writes to her mother, you haven't an idea of the dirt here. Miss Lyman and I just came from the church and we have black spots on our forehead. So yeah, I mean, it was just a whole different experience for her coming from New England. The woman in this picture is Mary Semple. I don't know if any of you heard of Mary Semple. She was came from a very prominent family. She actually came from Sewickley, and her father was a businessman, and I think her uncle was a banker. She is single, she's independently wealthy, based on her family. But she leaves the Presbyterian roots of her family, and she becomes a Unitarian. She is very close friends with another woman, Mary McCrum, who was a librarian. The two of them were stricken from Mrs. Thaw's social list, and you're going to hear about the Thaws. All these connections, okay? The two of them were stricken from Mrs. Thaw's social list when they joined the Unitarian Church. This is what, there does seem to be evidence for them experiencing, on some level, a certain, attitudes that were not very favorable to Unitarians here. Well, okay, the issue that really grabbed St. John's attention was the fact that the water was so bad here. And you may have heard stories of this, right? I need a drink here just a minute. I actually suffer from low sugar. So I bring water that has apple juice in it, so I get a little kick. Yeah. Don't worry. Okay, So they blamed the city, the corrupt city leaders and such, for standing in the way of progress, and there were certain people who were on the take and such. So the women, let's see, it's called the Women's Health Protective Association, organized what was called Sanitary Sunday, all right? And what they did with Sanitary Sunday is they urged all these ministers in town to speak on the issue of water purification, water filtration, right? So St. John turns his pulpit over to this guy here, James O. Handy, who is in his church, but he also is a chemist and works for the Pittsburgh testing laboratory. And so Handy gives this whole very technical, speech about why the water in Pittsburgh is so terrible and the high rate of death from typhoid fever, which is higher than almost any industrial city in the country. He explains all this, okay? All the water's coming down through the mountains and it's picking up the waste from every village as it goes before it gets down to Pittsburgh, all right? So this gets printed in the newspaper. This entire speech that Handy gives at the church gets printed in the newspaper. So anyway, this leads ultimately to the church putting together a committee called the Citizens League. And the Citizens League constructed a model water filter that they put on the lawn of the church. This is a postcard that was done up. I think based on the records, the water filter was actually behind the church, not on the front lawn. But Handy gives all kinds of statistics as to how effective it was, right? And they invited people in the city to come and get water from the water filter. Anybody could come and they would give them water. Ultimately, as you may know, this is, by the way, now I think 1898, okay? And Pittsburgh finally installs water filtration up in Aspinwall in 1907. And we all think that the Unitarians should get some credit when that story is told. Okay, moving forward, I'm watching my time. When did I actually start? About 20 of or so? Okay, I'm going to keep moving here. I timed this. I think I'm pretty close on 45 minutes for the whole thing. Okay, so St. John leaves in 1900, and he is followed by Walter Mason, who, comes from Franklin, Pennsylvania. Okay, so he's already a Western Pennsylvania native. It's no wonder then that he ends up staying at the church for almost 30 years. Interestingly, he also went to the Meadville Theological School, which was up there, in Meadville. But he had been serving a church in Gloucester, Massachusetts, which you may know is on the coast, and the skies are clear, and his wife writes about being able to see lighthouse after lighthouse after lighthouse, and then when she comes to Pittsburgh, it's all smoky and soot and everything. Walter stands at the window and says, "The clouds, the very clouds, tell me I am home." Well, okay. When Walter Mason was the minister here, the congregation actually sold that little church on Kirk Street and built this church on the corner of Morewood and Ellsworth. How many of you have seen it? Okay, you've seen it, right? This is quite a big jump from the other church, which was only built 10 years before. This was actually completed in 1904. So what happened? How come in this short period of time, all of a sudden, they sell the one little church and build this one? Well, what happened? How many of you know about Andrew Carnegie's organ philanthropy? He's giving away church organs to all these churches. Some of you? Okay, a couple of you know. Yeah, that was one of his things that he liked to do. And our music committee was able to get, I guess, one of the last of the outright organs that he gave away. But it was too big for the little church. So the question was, should they add on to the church in order to accommodate the organ, or should they build a new church, or find a new church? Well, meanwhile, the St. Paul's Cathedral people had bought this adjacent lot, okay? And when they heard that the Unitarian Church was going to expand in order to accommodate the organ, they were like, no, 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 don't do that. How about sell that lot to us? And, you know, just build yourself a bigger church. So anyway, there's a whole period of haggling. I won't get into all the details. It's pretty interesting. And finally, ultimately, the St. Paul's people paid $60,000 for that lot that had cost $10,000 10 years before. Okay. Now, where did they come up with that money? All right. Where did they come up with that money? Well, okay. Henry Clay Frick, okay, had just purchased their building downtown because he purchased their building, and I think it was the other Presbyterian church. He wanted to build his Union Arcade building on 4th Avenue. And where did he get all his money? He had merged his holdings with Henry Morgan to create U.S. Steel. Okay, so there's a lot of money rolling around Pittsburgh at this point in time, okay? And a lot of that ends up in developing Oakland and Shadyside, okay? All those, a lot of buildings. I talk about that and list the buildings and such. It's pretty interesting. Okay, I won't go into that here. But that is what then enabled them to spend a lot of money for that lot, and then at the same time enabled the Unitarians to build this much larger church. And I should have actually included a photograph of the organ. It's a Wershing organ. I mean, the church is really built to accommodate that. It's really fits in there beautifully. So that's kind of an interesting story. When Mason was there, this is already by 1910, he helped found another church, a Unitarian church in Allegheny, what was Allegheny City. They started it when it was still Allegheny City, but by the time they are formed, the Allegheny was incorporated into Pittsburgh. It now became the north side of Pittsburgh. This was somewhat under duress, okay? They didn't really like the idea. That's another story. And by 1910, they built this building. This is in the Mexican War Streets neighborhood. There's a story there of a Scotch-Irish gardener who was supposed to have said, too bad to build a Unitarian church on this corner. Asked what the Unitarians believed, he replied, I don't know exactly. I think it's something like the Mormons, only they haven't the women. You know, it's just, you know, some of those attitudes just come out that way. Okay. One of the exciting events of this period on January, does anybody need a break to, so I'll just keep going, right? Okay. Yes? Well, okay. I think in the interest of everybody, we'll just keep going here. But do feel if you need to get up, just go ahead. Okay, so Billy Sunday came to Pittsburgh in January 1914. You may know who he was, right? He was an active evangelical, fire and brimstone, also kind of a jokester, minister who traveled all over the country, set up these huge tabernacle type places that held, you know, 10, 20,000 people. And he did that here. He built this they built a big tabernacle for him. The city of Pittsburgh did, that held an audience of 20,000, and it was pretty much full 3 times a day for 7 weeks, okay? And what they did, this really accommodated the outlying areas. So all these people came from outlying areas in these trains, right? And he was very good at getting businesses to say they would sponsor him and sponsor the revival kind of thing, and then he would kind of press people to not go to businesses if they did not show up with, you know, their signs. So then all these sponsors get listed in the paper and that kind of thing, okay? But he's very hard on Unitarians. He attacks them and calls them ugly elephants and that kind of thing. And so finally, Reverend Mason and Reverend Snyder, who was at the Northside Church, start a series of sermons to try to counter what Billy Sunday is saying. And Mason puts out this really, really nice sermon that's very moderate, just explains what Unitarianism is about, and they end up, I can hardly believe this figure, but the record shows they got 75,000 requests for that sermon. I just can hardly believe it. But so they sent them everywhere. I mean, it actually created quite a lot of attention, more than I think Billy Sunday wanted. Here's President William Howard Taft coming out of the First Unitarian Church. He was here on the weekend of May 30, 1909. He was the honored guest at the first Pirates game played in the new Forbes Field. Okay? He says, my father was a Unitarian, my mother was a Unitarian, my grandmother was a Unitarian, and it has always been a wonder to me that all the world has not become Unitarian. But I think it is verging in that direction. This is 1909, he says this, okay? He also, that same weekend, attended Road of Shalom, okay? And he says at Road of Shalom, only the good people of Pittsburgh could get me to attend 2 services in one weekend. Anyway, so there they actually, of course, reinforced the pew that he was going to use. You can understand why. Now, I made a list of the sermons that Walter Mason gives over the course of his career at the church, and I think this is very interesting because I think it kind of demonstrates how his topics responded to the times, right? The first one is Response to a Revivalist, 1914. The Way to World Peace in 1915. Everybody's watching what's happening in Europe and they're very worried about what's going to happen with America. And it's a wonderful sermon talking about the need for inter-religious, international dialogue. At the same time you need international dialogue, you need inter-religious dialogue, a coming together of religions. A Nation in Mourning, 1919, of course, that's about all the loss that people had suffered in World War I. And he himself, one of his sons, had died in France, and his plane went down in 1918. Do you have a question?
Yeah, Kathleen, since these are all in the newspaper, is there anywhere where you can find all of this?
You can go to the Heinz Center. They're all there. It's an amazing collection. Many of them are still written in pencil, okay?
No one's kind of made them into a book or anything?
Well, you're talking about some of the things, the ideas that I've got going, okay? One of the things that we want to do is put them online, okay? His sermons in particular are so rich, and there's such a fine collection of them, and it would be really nice to have them made into PDFs and put online, you know? And we actually did get some money already from the UUA to do that, but I've only got so much time, and I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But right, we are working on that. So yes, he did lose his own son, and very sadly, the family, they lost their son Joseph, and 5 weeks later, their daughter, who just got married, went off on her honeymoon, and she was killed on her honeymoon. So in 5 weeks, the family lost a son and a daughter. It was very, very sad. In 1923, he gives a sermon, What Americans Can Learn from Russian Atheism. And of course, this is right after the Soviets had taken over. The Soviet Union was what? I mean, 1917 was the revolution, of course, and by 1920, they had pretty much beaten off all their opposition. But they squelched the Russian Orthodox Church, and what Mason says, he kind of defends this. He says, look, the Russian Orthodox Church was a tool of the czars. It's going to come back, and when it comes back, it will be the church of the people. And this is what that's kind of the gist of that sermon. And that's true. I mean, that has really become true. He gives a series of sermons on humanism. And of course, at this time, the 1920s, this was a time when more and more people were talking about religious humanism. I don't know how many of you know anything about that, but in Unitarian circles, it's a topic that we're pretty familiar with. He calls for what he calls a Catholicity of spirit, and he sees humanism as a language with which, regardless of how you feel about deity, any concept of deity, humanism is a language, provides a language by which people can cross religious lines. And what science can teach religion, it was his last sermon. He never gave it. It's still in pencil. He died very suddenly of pneumonia. And it's a great sermon. He just talks about science relies on inquiry, solid inquiry, and careful thought, right? Religion should also rely on solid inquiry and careful thought. We can't let religion off on a, what he calls the, I can't think of the word. We can't just let it, go wherever it wants. It needs to be thought about very carefully. And yeah, then he dies, and of course I'm going to kind of skip over some stuff here now just because, I want to say a couple other things about him. In 1921, I'm going to go back to that part of it. In 1921, as the country embraced prosperity, Mason reminded the young men and women that their birthright of success is not offered on easy terms. It comes with an obligation to use all wealth as tools and not as a means of self-gratification. There's just a lot of wisdom there for him. He also condemned the president and the lawmakers for not signing the Versailles Treaty. He condemned the disgraceful quarrel between the president and the Senate that had ended in an act of betrayal of the people and dishonor to the nation. Really strong stuff, really strong stuff. Plus, in 1922, he and the other minister, who was now Reverend Gebauer, at the Northside Church began preaching on KDKA radio. KDKA radio back in the 20s initiated every Sunday a minister gave a sermon. And the first Sunday of the month was the Unitarian hour. And so they traded off with other ministers, Okay, I think the interwar years was a very interesting time for Unitarians, at least in this instance, where as they were facing ending of the war, the rise of the Depression, the rise of fascism, watching Hitler march across Europe, both Mason and his successor pushed this idea of a Catholicity of spirit, the idea that somehow religions have to come together worldwide. Okay, now this next scene is after the war, 1944. This is the summer that American troops have joined with Canadian troops, right, and British troops in the invasion of Normandy, and they're going across Europe. And so what you have are farms that need help in harvesting crops. And so the new minister who had just come, Reverend Irving Murray, some of you may have heard of him, gets the youth involved in going out on Sundays to harvest crops at what was called the Simmons Farm. And actually called out there, it still exists. And they remember youth coming there and working on the farm. The article says that they did this to harvest food for victory, food for our troops, food for the starving people they are liberating. Young girls were advised to wear long pants to protect from the berry bushes and to trim their fingernails so as not to damage the fruit. Murray was called upon to defend the fact that they were harvesting on Sundays. He said, "This is our prayer for the invasion armies and for suffering people everywhere, a prayer spoken through work and service." Okay. At this time also, the Unitarians, at least here in Pittsburgh, became very involved in promoting racial integration. Okay, this now becomes a topic after World War II. They worked on behalf of trying to establish a permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission. There had been a wartime, what was called the FEPC, and now they pushed to have a permanent one here in Pittsburgh. One of the things that they also do, the Women's Alliance created the Morewood Nursery School, and they specifically designed it to be interracial and interfaith. And that, I think, was kind of a novel, very progressive thing to do, and probably one of the first such efforts, certainly in Pittsburgh. Now, as liberals, Unitarians have been targeted for investigations. Were targeted for investigations in the Red Scare of the late 40s and the 1950s. Haven't you heard of Matt Cvetic? A few of you. Okay. So this is a picture of Matt Cvetic. Matt Cvetic was hired by the FBI to come to Pittsburgh and infiltrate the nationality organizations, meaning the labor unions, right, here in Pittsburgh. he went under the pseudonym of Bob Stanton. Maybe you heard of that too. So he lived at the West Penn Hotel while he was here, and he then would get to know these people in these groups, and then he would decide who might be suspect, and he would name names and have them printed in the newspaper. Okay, and this was one of the tactics that was done, right? And of course, it was very frightening to people. Most people didn't actually go to jail for being communists. They just, their careers were destroyed, is what would happen. Well, one of the people that he named was the Reverend John Evan Evans, who was a very popular minister at the Northside Church at the time, for running a communist cell in the Unitarian Church up there. And it's just a remarkable evidence to show how he basically took off. Evans left within probably a week or so, maybe 2 weeks, and half the congregation left with him.
Was he running a communist cell?
He was seen, he's been evaluated later as someone who was probably running what might be, he was probably a socialist of some sort. He was, they have at the Northside Unitarian Church, they have an adjacent building they call Unitarian House, okay? And I think they used that house as a lyceum for people to come and talk. They always were more radical in their thinking, in their philosophy, than the church here in Shadyside. One minister later just really evaluates him when he died as, probably in some kind of social service kind of, agency kind of work sort of thing, okay? I wouldn't say he was a communist, okay? And understand, a lot of people who got accused of being communist in the late 40s and early 50s, they may have had communist connections from the 30s, but don't forget, the communists were our friends in, they were, Russia was our ally in World War I, World War II, right, okay? So a lot of people who were thought to be communist, sometimes that gets very distorted.
But didn't it reflect badly that he fled? Weren't people upset?
Oh, you had to. You had to. Yeah, people did. It was a very, one of the reasons that, I don't want to go into a whole long thing about, he actually left the ministry completely. He left the ministry, he became a librarian.
Probably nobody would hire him.
Well, that's the thing. A lot of people, at that time there was also the editor of the Christian, what was it called? The Unitarian newspaper. It was called the Christian, what was it called? Register. He also was dismissed from his job because he was thought to be too communist. A lot of people. All right, so I'm sort of coming to the end here. The 60s and 70s was a very tumultuous time. Pete Seeger came to Pittsburgh to sing. Of course, he was all about singing peace songs. And he was under investigation by HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. He was supposed to sing for WQED and for the Young Men and Women's Hebrew Association, and both venues canceled him. So the Unitarians hosted him, and he sang at the Unitarian Church to 2 concerts and filled the house. 900 people heard him sing. Now I'm just going to say a few little things, more things here. This is kind of a listing of all the, a number of the social justice activities that the Unitarians have engaged in since the 60s, even up to today. Probably the most contentious one was symbolic sanctuary. And I'm going to have to sit down. I think it's probably a combination of the heat and, that's mostly the heat. In any case, one of the things that I discovered as I was working on this book was how very divisive things got in the 60s and 70s. And I don't know how many of you have been in churches during that time or know about churches during that time, what your affiliations have been, but it was a divisive time for people. And this church was no different because people divided on whether or not to support the war, or not to support the war. There was just a lot of issues. Symbolic sanctuary was the idea that the church would provide a haven for draft resistors, okay? So the church had this big vote, okay? There was a man in the church who was president of the ACLU, and he, of course, very much favored this. The minister also favored it. His own grandfather had fled Prussia to escape conscription there. So in any case, they had this vote. Now, I have the numbers here. I'm not going to read them because I want to just move ahead with this. But I will say that the no votes, okay, and this I think is oftentimes true in churches and other organizations, the no votes mostly came from members who had been in the church 10 years or longer. The yes votes came from people who had joined within the last 10 years, had joined since Reverend Cahill had come to the church, and I think that says a lot. What happened with this, and I think this also happens in various organizations, it produced a lot of acrimony, because what happened is the board overrode the vote. The vote was in the favor of it, but it was so slim that the board decided we can't go forward with this, it's just too slim of a margin. And there was so much acrimony then directed at the board and the people who were against it, say by the people who were for it. And so, a lot of people left over this. It just created a lot of problems. The stories here tell us, where it was a human organization, right? And it became divided on many of these fronts. But there were some things that people could agree on. This is Jesse Cavalier. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. He was a very important minister on the north side. When Jesse was not in the pulpit preaching, he was on the sidewalk. And he did a lot of street ministry. And here he is. This is an interfaith demonstration on behalf of United Farm Workers to boycott lettuce and grapes on behalf of the farm workers. Okay, so now I'm just going to run through and show you some pictures of all the Unitarian churches that are in the area today. That is, on the left is Allegheny today. That's what was in the Northside Church. This is the South Hills Church. They actually bought a big mansion, and then they enlarged it to make room for a meeting room, and it's lovely. There's a fireplace in there. We have two members from it sitting right here in the front row. This is the East Suburban Church. They're out there in Murraysville. This is the little Smithton Church, historically Universalist, still there, still operating by a thread, but it is still operating. This is the North Hills Church, which actually they bought an old dairy barn and renovated it to be a church, and it's absolutely gorgeous. If you ever want to go up there sometime and see it, it's just amazing what they have done with that, and they put a second floor in it, and it's just wonderful. And then there's another church out in Indiana. There's another one in Ligonier. I don't have a picture of that, and there's another one up in Slippery Rock called Ginger Hill. And this is the First Unitarian Church today in Shadyside, okay? I just put a few little figures here. Membership is about 430, roughly. It's a body of diverse people, theologically very diverse in terms of where they stand on things. The glue that kind of holds people together there, some people just don't quite understand that, but how you can have a church with people with different views. But the glue that holds everybody together is the idea that we're basically here to serve each other, to make life better for people here on earth. We have an active campus ministry, we have active religious education, we are part of the ECM Cooperative Ministry Program. We are part of PIN, the Pittsburgh Interfaith Impact Network. Okay, and that's kind of, and you know what the banner says on the bell tower, right? Civil marriage is a civil right. That's been there for quite some time. A lot of consensus around that issue. Okay, so I'm just going to say a couple final thoughts here. The Unitarians merged with the Universalists in 1961, have been theologically responsive to social and political change over time. In the 20th century, the challenges of modernism, the rise of scientific thought, the call for a world unifying religion in the face of world wars, depression, and racism, have brought Unitarians to the point of being a more inclusive society that respects the dignity of every person. But there have been rifts and splits. How should new understandings of society be incorporated into liberal religious practice? So it's not been an easy thing, and there's always been, disagreements and struggles, okay? The answers have not always been clear as to how to go forward with some of these differences. We've always been a very small denomination, we still are, but our life and impact within the city of Pittsburgh has been substantial, and my book tells that story. So, I think I kind of went over my time just a little bit here. Are there any questions? Yes?
That figure membership, 430, that membership in that particular church in Shadyside.
Yeah, that's just that one church. I think Northside, I think Allegheny has about 100 members. The other churches are quite a bit smaller.
How do they maintain a building like that?
They don't have to pay for it.
Well, the building was paid for a long time ago. The building was paid for a long time ago. I mean, people pledge, and yeah, we have to work at it. Yeah.
Is Needville still in existence?
Yes.
Is it the oldest continuous Unitarian church?
Well, I suppose you could say that, yes, because it never folded the way we did. We'd say that we were the first, right? We were the first Unitarian church west of the Allegheny Mountains. They are the oldest continuous church west of the Allegheny Mountains in the fact that they never really went out of business, like we did twice. Okay, so, yeah. It's interesting because the man who started that church is a Dutch land developer, Harm-Jan Heidekoper. Okay, you've heard of him, okay. He's very much a part of this story. The whole second chapter is about him and the Meadville people. He came to Pittsburgh to do business with Bakewell on glass and such, and they became close friends. And he's very much influenced by Reverend Campbell, the first minister here. Campbell had said to him, it's not just a privilege to study the Bible, it's a duty, okay? And so Heidi Cooper goes home and he studies, and he decides he is going to be a Unitarian too. So then he starts this church. He starts it in 1826. It actually becomes incorporated in 1829, and they build their building in 1835. Okay? And the Heinz Center has all these letters on file that Bakewell wrote to Heidi Cooper. They are just wonderful. Okay? If you're interested in it, if you know Heidi Cooper and you want, okay, read those letters. What's really sad is that the letters that Heidi Cooper wrote back, we cannot find. They're not there. Okay? But both Heidi Cooper and Bakewell wrote letters to what was then the American Unitarian Association, these guys off in Boston, who were placing ministers, all along the Ohio River and whatnot. They both wrote letters to these guys at the AUA. So, and those I got from Harvard. Those letters are the Harvard Divinity School, all right? Heidi Cooper's letters are there, I read all them. Bakewell's letters are all there, I read all them, and they're ordering tracts and having all these Unitarian tracts sent out to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh becomes the place to distribute tracts in the West, okay? And they go down the Ohio River and they go up to Meadville. And the other thing I was going to say about Heidi Cooper is he not only founds the church. In 1844, the same year that Bakewell died, he founded this theological school, the Meadville Theological School, okay? Which stays there until 1925, okay? In 1925, that school moved to Chicago and it became the Meadville Lombard Theological School, okay? Where many of the Unitarian ministers get their training. They either go to Harvard or they go to Meadville Lombard, or some of them go out to a school out in San Francisco called Star King, which is named after this famous minister who was out there. So this has a long trajectory. Okay, the Heidi Cooper Meadville connection becomes very important to this story. And did you have a question about that? Did you want to? No, okay.
How did the Harvard get into the act? How were they involved?
Well, Harvard, of course, was founded back in the 1630s by the Puritans, right? And they trained their ministers there. The Puritans eventually became Congregationalists, and many threads of Congregationalism became more liberal and eventually evolved into Unitarianism, okay? And it was at Harvard, when they named this guy named Henry Ware to be director of the divinity program there, that was in 1805. This was sort of like all the conservatives were like, oh, this is terrible, you know, we can't have this, you know. So then they went off and founded Andover, which was then for the more traditional Orthodox people. And then Harvard was became the school for the Unitarians. And so a lot of the Unitarian records are there in their archives. Anything else? I'm happy to. My good friend Audrey Masaladon is over here. Audrey was extremely helpful all through this project. She goes to the First Unitarian Church, and she's head of our history committee, and she worked with me on finding stuff online, all kind of obituaries and whatnot, which are of course very valuable, lots of information, and also census data and whatnot. And she also edited every chapter of the book with me, so that was great. Anyway, she's there to kind of help if any of you are interested in purchasing a copy of the book. They're right over there on that table. Yes?
Unitarianism has been mostly in the English language, of course. But has it gone over into any of the other countries of the world? To what extent?
Absolutely.
Church.
Spain,
Church is older than that.
yeah.
To what extent?
I mean, some of the earliest Unitarians were in Transylvania and in Czechoslovakia. One of the most powerful church movements in Europe was in Czechoslovakia. Started in, I believe, the 1920s by a guy named Norbert Kapek. He ends up founding what was the biggest Unitarian church in Europe in Prague, and he will be taken captive by the Nazis and ends up dying in, I think it's Dachau. He ends up being put to death in Dachau. But before he died, he started a special, I guess you call it a practice of what's called a flower communion or a flower celebration, where people bring flowers and then they exchange the flowers in the service. And this was his way of trying to hang on to a symbol of life in the face of the march of the Nazis in Czechoslovakia. So
What is it called in Czechoslovakia?
it's a Unitarian.
Is that
Well, I'm
the
sure
word?
there's another name, I don't know Czechoslovak language, right? But yeah, it's a Unitarian congregation. Mhm. There's Unitarians in India. Okay. We have a sister congregation in the Kazi Hills in India. We go back and forth, we send people there. We have helped found a, what is it, is it an orphanage there? No, it's a
School.
It's a school. A school there. There's other people in my church who are involved in that. I haven't really been that directly involved in it, but yeah.
What's the name of the book that you mentioned about founding families?
Oh, yes. Joseph Ruschel, he teaches at Duquesne, and I'm not sure when this book came out. It's called The Founding Families of Pittsburgh. That's what it is. You have it? Yeah, anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, Founding Families of Pittsburgh. It's very interesting. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Thank you so much for your attention on hot night. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Wonderful.